High in the Andes, long before European sails ever kissed the western horizon, a civilization stirred among the clouds. They were not born in palaces or forged by swords. They emerged from stone terraces, mountain trails, and a reverence for nature so deep it shaped every brick of their rising empire. This is the beginning of the Inca people, who would carve an empire from one of the world's harshest terrains. The story begins in the Sacred Valley, near present-day Cusco. According to legend, the sun god Inti sent his son Manco and his daughter-wife Mama Aclo to civilize the people of the Andes. Armed with a golden staff, they searched for fertile land where the staff would sink effortlessly into the soil. That spot was Cusco. There, the myth says, civilization took root. But myth is just the surface. In reality, the Inca were not the first civilization of the Andes. They were preceded by cultures like the Pamocha, the Wari, and the Tiu. Each left ruins, pottery, and systems of governance that the Inca would later study, absorb, and refine. The Incas didn't appear out of nowhere. They were a product of centuries of experimentation, warfare, and adaptation. What made them extraordinary was not that they invented everything, but that they unified it all. By the early 13th century, the Inca were a small, regional tribe, living around Cusco, but something changed in the 1430s. A man named Pachacuti, whose name means, he who overturns time, rose to power. He wasn't born heir to the throne, he seized it. When Cusco was attacked by a rival group, Pachacuti led a counter-offensive that not only saved the city, but also laid the foundation for imperial expansion. He didn't just fight wars, he built a vision. Pachacuti restructured the government, developed an administrative class, and transformed Cusco into a radiant stone capital designed to reflect celestial order. Roads began to stretch from the city in all directions, straight as arrows over cliffs and through valleys. These roads weren't just for soldiers, they were arteries for information, diplomacy, and commerce. At the heart of it all was Cusco, designed like a puma, with temples and palaces as its sacred organs. One of Pachacuti's most brilliant innovations was the Micmac system, a policy of forced resettlement. Conquered peoples were relocated across the empire to break up ethnic unity and discourage rebellion. Meanwhile, loyal Inca subjects were placed into new territories to spread imperial values. It was social engineering on a continental scale. Another tool of control was the Quipus system of knotted cords used to record data. Though still not fully deciphered, Quipus allowed officials to track population, resources, and tribute without a written language. This was bureaucracy built with string, and it worked. The empire grew fast. From the highlands of modern-day Peru, it expanded north into Ecuador, south into Chile, and east into the Amazon basin. By the time of Pachacuti's grandson, Huayna Capac, the Inca Empire known as Tawantinsuyu, or the Four Regions, spanned over 3,000 miles. It was the largest empire in the Pre-Columbian Americas. But this was not just a military feat. The Inca imposed unity through infrastructure, ritual, and reciprocity. Roads were flanked by way stations, where Chasqui fleet-footed messengers would run messages across the empire in relay. Fields were divided into thirds, one for the gods, one for the Inca state, and one for the people. Every village contributed labor to massive state projects in a system called meta, a kind of tax paid with time and effort rather than coin. Despite their imperial reach, the Inca had no currency, no wheels, and no writing. What they had was control of terrain, of people, of time. Festivals marked the solar calendar. Architecture mirrored the stars. Their temples, like the Coricancha, were plated in gold, not for vanity, but because gold was considered the sweat of the Suna, divine material meant for sacred spaces. Yet for all their grandeur, the seeds of vulnerability were already planted. The empire relied heavily on a single ruler and centralized command. Rebellions simmered in distant provinces. The succession system was ambiguous, and beyond the coast, invisible to them, ships were beginning to cross oceans with foreign ambitions. But in this moment, in this segment of time, the Inca stood tall. An empire not of conquest alone, but of unity, ritual, and astonishing innovation. From a sacred valley to the edge of the known world, they built something rare: an empire in harmony with the mountains. And they believed it would last forever, stretching across mountains, deserts, valleys, and jungle. The Inca road network was a marvel of ancient engineering, a silent web that bound an empire together. Known as the Capacone, or Royal Road, this vast system extended more than 24,000 miles, traversing some of the most extreme terrain on Earth, without wheels, without iron tools, and without horses. The Inca built roads that are still visible today, carved into sheer cliffs, Others laid across salt flats and swamps. They connected distant provinces to the heart of Cusco, binding diverse peoples into a single imperial rhythm. The genius of the Capacone was not in its length alone. It was in its function. The roads served not only the movement of armies, but also administrators, priests, engineers, and above all, messengers. The Chasqui, elite runners trained from youth, ran these roads in relays, carrying messages encoded in Quipus, the knotted cords that recorded numerical and logistical data. A message could travel from Ecuador to Cusco in just a few days, passed from runner to runner at tambos, roadside lodges, spaced roughly every 15 kilometers. These tambos provided food, shelter, and supplies, ensuring that the imperial pulse never missed a beat. Imagine the scene: a Chasqui sprinting up a narrow mountain trail, hair cropped, tunic tight, sandals gripping the stone path. He carries a wooden baton and a quipu wrapped around his chest. At the top of the ridge, another runner waits. The handoff takes seconds. The baton is passed, and the second runner darts away without pause, racing down the switchbacks as a condor wheels above. The roads were meticulously constructed, often with layered stone foundations that resisted erosion. Drainage channels lined the edges. Rope suspension bridges spanned gorges, anchored with woven ichu grass. These bridges had to be rebuilt regularly, a communal effort involving entire villages. In some places, stairs were carved directly into the rock. In others, flat stones were laid across marshes like stepping. Each environment demanded a different technique, and the Inca met the challenge with adaptation and discipline. But the roads were not open to everyone. Use of the royal highways was a privilege controlled by the state. Commoners needed permission to travel. Unauthorized movement was discouraged. The empire depended on order, and the roads were its circulatory system. Even the imperial armies moved according to the rhythms set by these roads. Supply lines were calculated down to the last measure of maize or wool. In addition to tambos, the Inca constructed calcas, or storage depots, at intervals along the road system. These granaries were stocked with dried potatoes, maize, quinoa, jerky, and textile strategic reserves that could sustain troops or relieve famine-stricken areas. Built with ventilation and stone walls, calcas were cool and dry, preserving food for years. The existence of these storage systems is one of the reasons the Inca could expand so rapidly. Logistics preceded conquest. At certain junctions, there were also US&U ceremonial platforms, where officials could conduct rituals or proclamations. These spaces symbolized the sacred nature of the road itself. For the Inca, infrastructure was not just practical, it was spiritual. The roads mirrored the paths of the stars. Cusco was the center of the world, and the roads radiated outward like celestial lines, connecting heaven and earth. Not all paths were created equal. The Royal Road, which ran from Quito in the north to in the south, was the empire's backbone. A second major artery followed the Pacific coast, linking desert settlements and fishing communities. Together, these routes formed a kind of imperial spine, highland and lowland, sun and sea. The two main roads were joined by hundreds of smaller routes, linking valleys, provinces, and settlements large and small. It's important to remember that these roads were used by foot traffic and llamas, the only pack animals available. Llamas were not ridden, but they could carry loads across long distances. The Inca maximized this humble capability through organization. A caravan of llamas might stretch for hundreds of meters, each animal led by a herder, bearing sacks of coca leaves, copper tools, or ceremonial textiles. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they were stunned by the scope and quality of these roads. Chroniclers compared them favorably to Roman roads. In some places, they found staircases climbing straight up cliffs. In others, they saw wide avenues lined with stones so tightly fitted that not even a knife blade could fit between them. Yet, the empire that had built them had done so without the wheel, without the arch, and without a writing system. They had used labor, coordination, and vision. The roads endured even as the empire fell. For decades after the conquest, Spanish forces and messengers used the same tambos and trails, often relying on native guides. The roads remained the fastest way through the Andes. In some parts of Peru, they are still used today by farmers, herders, and hikers who follow the same ancient steps. In the story of the Inca, the Capacone represents more than engineering. It embodies the concept of order through connection. In a landscape fractured by peaks and rivers, the Inca drew straight lines. They did not overcome the land, they wove into it, building continuity where none seemed possible. The roads taught distant communities to speak the same language of tribute and loyalty. They enabled fast response to rebellion, swift distribution of resources, and a shared imperial identity. Without these roads, the Inca Empire could not have existed. And though the temples may have crumbled, the paths remain etched into the bones of the Andes, leading still from the past into the present. At the heart of the Inca Empire, nestled in the Andean highlands, at over 11,000 feet above sea level, stood Cusco, the navel of the world. It wasn't just the capital. It was the center of time, space, and empire. The Inca believed Cusco had been designed by the gods and drawn by divine geometry. It wasn't simply built. It was shaped to embody power. And to this day, the foundations of that vision remain. From the sky, Cusco was said to resemble the shape of a puma, a sacred animal in Inca cosmology. The head of the beast was the fortress of a vast terraced structure built from megalithic stones, each one carefully cut and fitted without mortar. The body of the puma extended through the city's ceremonial avenues. Its tail pointed toward the confluence of rivers. The very layout of the city was symbolic, spiritual, and strategic. In the heart of Cusco was the Coricancha, or Temple of the Sun, the empire's most sacred site. Covered in sheets of gold that glimmered in the highland sun, it honored Inti, the sun god and divine ancestor of the emperor. Inside, golden altars, mummies of former emperors, and ceremonial vessels all testified to the Inca belief that their rulers were both human and divine. The Coricancha was not just a temple, it was a cosmic axis, the point from which sacred lines, or Sikhs, radiated outward to the four corners of the empire. Each sect connected to a waka, a holy site in the landscape. Some were springs, caves, stones, or mountains. These sacred markers were used for rituals, sacrifices, and seasonal ceremonies. The entire city was embedded in a web of meaning, where geography, architecture, and religion blended seamlessly. Every wall, every plaza, every channel of water was part of a larger spiritual design. Cusco's architecture reflected more than belief. It demonstrated mastery. Inca builders used ashlar masonry, finely cut stones that fit together so precisely that even centuries of earthquakes have failed to bring them down. Instead of resisting natural forces, the walls were designed to move with them. Trapezoidal doors, sloped walls, and interlocking stones made buildings resilient without any mortar. It was engineering with humility, built to live in harmony with the earth. The city wasn't just ceremonial, it was administrative and residential. Noble families lived in houses arranged around inner courtyards, with walls of polished stone. Servants and retainers worked in attached quarters. Nearby were warehouses filled with tribute goods, and armories stocked with weapons and armor. Everything was organized. Because Cusco was the empire in miniature. At the center of civic life was the Hokaipata, the Great Plaza. Here, festivals unfolded. Armies gathered. Foreign envoys stood before the emperor. Ceremonial dances honored the gods. During Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun, thousands would converge on Cusco. Priests chanted, sacrifices were made, and the emperor, clad in golden feathers, addressed his people. It was political theater. It was spiritual affirmation. It was control. Yet Cusco was not the only city. Across the empire, the Inca built urban centers that echoed its layout. In the Sacred Valley, cities like Ollantaytambo and Pisac demonstrated the same pattern. Terraced agriculture on the slopes, ceremonial centers in the core, elite residences overlooking the rest. Each city had roads, temples, and warehouses, designed not for personal expression, but for imperial function. The Inca vision of urban life was ordered, sacred, and efficient. Perhaps the most iconic city the Inca ever built was one that was never meant to be seen, at least not by outsiders. High in the cloud forest, on a ridge between steep mountains, sits Machu Picchu. Although its full purpose remains debated, it may have been a royal retreat, an astronomical observatory, or a sacred center for elite rituals. What we do know is that Machu Picchu embodies the peak of Inca design. Every stone is cut with care. Every terrace channels water. Every doorway frames the movement of the sun. Even in its isolation, Machu Picchu followed the same logic as Cusco. Sacred alignment, careful planning, integration with the landscape. Inca cities were not imposed on nature. They were woven into it. This integration was no accident. It was the product of state-planned urbanism, rare in the ancient world. In newly conquered areas, the Inca often built new cities from scratch, placing them at strategic crossroads or near resources. These centers helped spread the imperial culture, language, dress, laws, and served as nodes in a growing network of control. They were also tools of assimilation. Local elites were brought into these cities, given homes and taught the ways of Cusco. What made these cities unique was not grandeur, but order. No slums, no markets, no private enterprise. The economy was state-managed. Goods were stored, distributed, and accounted for by officials. The streets were clean. Water was channeled through stone aqueducts. Crime was rare. Surveillance was constant. Life in an Inca city was predictable by design. Even after the fall of the empire, the stones of Cusco and other Inca cities remained. Spanish conquistadors built their churches atop Inca temples, their homes on Inca foundations. In many streets of modern Cusco, you still walk between those same ancient stones, fitted by hand, placed for eternity, built in the image of empire. The cities of the Inca were more than places to live. They were machines of administration, mirrors of the cosmos, and tools of authority. They were stone-bound prayers. And through them, we can still glimpse how a people once shaped a continent, not with steel or wheels, but with vision, stone, and an unshakable sense of order. To understand the Inca, you must first understand their land, not just as terrain, but as spirit. The Inca didn't simply live in the Andes. They listened to it, honored it, and built their empire in conversation with it. Mountains were not obstacles. Rivers were not just resources. These were living beings, woven into the sacred fabric of existence. The Inca world was defined by sacred geography, a way of seeing the landscape as alive, divine, and interconnected. Central to this worldview were the Apus, mountain spirits, ancient and powerful, each with its own personality and authority. Every community in the empire had its own Apu, a guardian peak, a divine overseer. Offerings were made, prayers were whispered, and rituals performed to ensure the Apus remained pleased. To anger a mountain was to risk disaster. Not metaphorically, but literally. The mountains weren't alone. The Inca believed that Waka's sacred places or objects were scattered across the land like stars in the sky. Some Wakas were stones, others springs, caves, trees, or even unusual shapes in the land. Each one held spiritual power, and each was connected by Sikhs, invisible lines radiating out from Cusco, like the spokes of a wheel. The sect system mapped not only religious sites, but also the empire's political and social structure. In this spiritual web, every region had a role. Every ritual had a direction. Time itself moved along the land. Water, too, was sacred. The Inca engineered intricate aqueducts, canals, and ritual fountains. But they did so not just for utility, but for harmony. Flowing water was a gift from the gods, and had to be channeled respectfully. At the Temple of the Sun in Cusco, spring water was guided through carved channels for ceremonial purification. In places like, entire complexes were built around water's flow, blending engineering and reverence. The Inca calendar, lunar and solar, was also rooted in geography. Priests tracked the movement of the sun over mountains and valleys. Solstices and equinoxes weren't marked by clocks, but by sun pillars and the shadow lines they cast across sacred hills. Astronomy wasn't separate from the land. It was measured through it. Perhaps the most extraordinary example of this sacred landscape is found atop the high mountains themselves. In what may be one of the most extreme ritual practices in human history, the Inca conducted Kapakuka ceremonies, child sacrifices, atop peaks over 20,000 feet high. Climbing for days, braving cold and wind, priests brought chosen children to these summits, dressed in fine garments, and given chica to drink. They were laid to rest in stone tombs, believed to become messengers between the earthly and divine. Their bodies, preserved by the freezing air, have been discovered in modern times, astonishingly intact. They are both tragic and telling. These mountaintop sacrifices weren't cruel spectacles. They were sacred gifts, meant to balance cosmic forces, to maintain order in the world. For the Inca, the line between nature and the divine was thin. Life and death were part of a larger cycle. The land demanded reverence, and the empire obliged. Agriculture itself was embedded in this spiritual logic. The Inca terraced entire mountainsides, not just to grow food efficiently, but to honor Pachamama, the Earth Mother. Every planting was a conversation. Ceremonies preceded sowing and harvest. The first cut of the potato field was never done casually. Tools were blessed, songs were sung. The land was alive and listening. In places like Moray, the Inca created circular agricultural terraces that descend like an amphitheater into the earth. Some scholars believe these were experimental farms, used to test how crops grew in different conditions. Others see deeper meaning, that these rings mirrored cosmological beliefs, or represented a sacred descent into the womb of the earth. Perhaps both are true. For the Inca, function and faith were rarely separate. Even the empire's vast road network, minus 40,000 kilometers stretching over deserts, mountains, and jungles, was a sacred act. Way stations called tambos dotted the path, offering shelter, food, and ritual stops. Travelers carried not only goods and messages, but also the empire's ideology. Runners paused to offer coca to the mountain gods. Priests walked the roads during state pilgrimages. Every footstep was part of a larger ritual landscape. One of the most striking expressions of this is the Capac Own, the Great Inca Road. It linked the empire north to south, from present-day Colombia to Chile. But more than a highway, it was a line of power, stitched through sacred valleys and across river gorges by stone bridges and ceremonial causeways. In walking it, you weren't just moving, you were engaging in sacred geography. When the Spanish arrived, they misunderstood this world. They saw mountains and valleys, but not gods. They saw roads and terraces, but not offerings. They built churches on top of huacas, tore down temples, and banned indigenous ceremonies. Yet the landscape remembered, and in many communities today, the old ways endure. In the mountains, still honored. In the springs, still blessed. In the quiet rituals of farmers who never forgot. The Inca didn't conquer the Andes. They became part of it. Their genius wasn't in dominating nature, it was in aligning with it. Sacred geography wasn't decoration. It was the structure of the world, the skeleton of empire. And through it, they built a civilization as vast as it was rooted, as orderly as it was on. When most civilizations rise, they do so in places of abundance, fertile river valleys, open plains, predictable weather. The Inca defied this norm. They built an empire in one of the most challenging terrains on earth. And yet, their cities still stand. Their roads still run across the land. Their stonework, impossibly precise, has outlasted earthquakes, storms, and time itself. They were not just survivors of the Andes, they mastered it. The true marvel of Inca engineering begins with their intimate understanding of the land. Unlike other empires that reshaped the earth to fit their designs, the Inca adapted their architecture to the environment, responding to every slope, every fault line, every cliff. Nowhere is this more visible than in their mountain cities. Most famously, Machu Picchu. Perched over 2,400 meters above sea level, Machu Picchu is more than just a lost city. It is an architectural conversation with the mountain. Terraces descend like a giant staircase, both stabilizing the soil and growing crops. Water channels flow seamlessly through the complex, catching runoff and guiding it through ritual fountains and down the slopes. Foundations were dug deep into bedrock. Roofs, now gone, once arched in perfect alignment with solar movement. But the stonework holds the secret to their genius. The Inca were masters of ashlar masonry. Stone blocks carved to fit together without mortar, so precisely aligned that even a knife blade cannot fit between them. These stones were not uniform. Each was shaped uniquely, like an enormous 3D puzzle. The fit was intentional, not decorative. In fact, this interlocking method allowed walls to flex during earthquakes, rather than collapse. In regions of seismic activity, the Inca had unknowingly outperformed many modern buildings. They didn't fight the Earth's movement, they flowed with it. In Cusco, the capital of the empire, this method reached its apex. The fortress, overlooking the city, is a marvel of form and function. Massive zigzagging walls, made of stones weighing up to 200 tons, still stand today. How the Inca moved and placed such stones remains a mystery. They had no iron tools, no wheels. And yet, the placement is flawless. Wasn't just military, it was ceremonial, architectural theater. It demonstrated state power through stone. Their roads, to reveal a society that saw infrastructure as sacred and strategic. The Capacone, the royal road network, was carved through cliffs, stretched across valleys with rope suspension bridges, and climbed sheer rock faces with carved steps. These roads weren't mere trails, they were arteries of empire. They connected highland cities with coastal trade centers, military outposts with religious shrines, over 40,000 kilometers of them, all built without metal tools or beasts of burden. Llamas could carry loads, but the human runner, the chasqui, was the soul of the system. Every 6 to 9 kilometers, a tambo shelter housed fresh messengers, allowing information and goods to move across the empire in record time. Messages were carried, not by paper, but by Quipus knotted strings, whose codes we still don't fully understand. Yet the Inca didn't just build for efficiency. They built for beauty and balance. Temples and plazas were often aligned with astronomical events. In Cusco, the Temple of the Sun Coricancha was lined with gold panels and housed sacred mummies of past rulers. Its walls were perfectly aligned to capture the solstice sun, illuminating inner chambers in an annual display of cosmic order. Even after the Spanish looted the gold and built a church atop its ruins, the Inca foundation remained. The colonial structure rests quite literally on the strength of Inca engineering. Perhaps most impressive is the hydraulic ingenuity that the Inca wove into their cities and farms. In an ancient agricultural and ceremonial site, water flows down sculpted channels, across terraces, and through ceremonial baths. The precision of gradient and pressure regulation shows a deep understanding of hydraulics. Water didn't just irrigate, it purified, blessed, sustained. Their aqueducts, still functional in some areas, carried spring water over kilometers. They harnessed water not just as resource, but as ritual. And still, their greatest engineering may have been psychological. Inca architecture made you feel small before the state. Terraces carved into mountain faces spoke of labor power. Massive stones testified to state control of resources and skill. City layouts funneled movement toward temples and plazas, where ritual and power converged. Architecture became ideology, etched into stone and space. Their storehouses culcus-lined roads and mountaintops, organized to maximize preservation in cold, dry air. Food and supplies were stored not for profit, but for redistribution. During drought or famine, these silos became lifelines. Their placement across the empire was not random, it was logistical planning, centuries ahead of its time. Engineering, for the Inca, was not just about buildings. It was about stability, physical, political, and spiritual. Even the choice of material told a story. Stones were not merely quarried, they were awakened. Workers chanted and performed rituals before moving them. In construction, priests often led ceremonies to sanctify the space. The building process itself was a sacred act. This wasn't superstition, it was cohesion. It made every citizen a part of the empire's stone body. Today, we see the ruins. But to the Inca, these were not ruins, they were living parts of a cosmic order. Walls were not silent, they spoke of power, precision, and piety. Every terrace, road, and stone was a thread in a massive, living web. When Spanish chroniclers saw Inca cities, they marveled, but they misunderstood. They measured greatness in gold. The Inca built in stone, and in stone, they whispered across centuries. Their empire, though fallen, still stands beneath our feet. The Inca Empire, known as Tawantinsuyu, meaning the four regions together, was not just held together by its mighty roads or stone walls. It was held together by its astonishingly effective system of governance. In an age without paper records, without currency, and without a written language, the Inca built one of the most orderly and centralized bureaucracies the world had ever seen. At the top of this complex hierarchy stood the Sapa Inca, the unique Inca, regarded not only as a king, but as a living god. The direct descendant of the sun god Inti. His word was law, and his power absolute. But he did not rule alone. Beneath him was a meticulous pyramid of authority, one that reached into every corner of the Andes. The empire was divided into four vast regions, or sayas, each administered by a trusted noble. These were further broken down into provinces, and then again into smaller units, called Elis, a basic building block of Inca society. An elu was more than a village. It was a kin group, a farming community, a mutual aid society, and a political unit, all in one. Every person belonged to one, and every elu was tightly woven into the state. Labor was the currency of the Inca world. There was no money, no markets in the traditional sense. Instead, each citizen paid tax through work, the mita system. A rotating draft of laborers built roads, farmed imperial lands, served in the military, or worked in mines and quarries. This labor was not forced in the brutal sense, but it was expected, and it was meticulously organized. Each province kept census records, not on paper, but with Quipus bundles of knotted strings in various colors. Specially trained record keepers, known as Quipucameocs, maintained these tactile spreadsheets, tracking everything from population to harvest yields. Recent research suggests that these knots may even have held phonetic or symbolic meanings, though we are still unraveling their full code. What's striking is the sheer efficiency of it all. Each administrator was responsible for a set number of families, and these responsibilities scaled upward in a clear and logical hierarchy. Every 10 families had a local overseer. Every 100 had another. This system allowed decisions from the imperial court in Cusco to be implemented across thousands of miles, even in the most remote highland valleys. But governance wasn't just about organization, it was about integration. When the Inca conquered a new group, they didn't simply impose rule by the sword. Instead, they blended cultural control with incentives. Local elites were often retained, but their children were brought to Cusco to be educated in the Inca way of life. These children, noble hostages of a sort, would return as loyal administrators. The process created a common identity across a vast, diverse empire. Common language played a part too. While dozens of languages were spoken across Tawantinsuyu, the state promoted Quechua as the administrative lingua franca. It wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Language unified the realm and subtly displaced local authority. The redistribution of goods was another tool of cohesion. The state collected resources from across the empire: corn from the valleys, potatoes from the highlands, fish from the coast, and redistributed them through vast state warehouses. These kulkas dotted the landscape, often built high in the mountains, where the cool air preserved food naturally. In times of drought, war, or hardship, these stores ensured survival. The people knew. The empire provided. Even religion was woven into the governance system. The state religion, centered around Inti, the sun god, was promoted across the empire, but in a careful and inclusive way. Local deities were not always banned. In fact, they were often adopted into the Inca pantheon, subordinated but respected. Temples were built not just for faith, but for loyalty. The most important shrines, like the Coricancha in Cusco, were both religious and political centers. The government also managed work and life cycles. Marriages were sanctioned. Housing was assigned. Clothing, too, was regulated. Your social status was immediately visible by your woven patterns and colors. For the elite, finely woven compi cloth served not only as clothing, but as tribute and diplomatic gifts. Punishments for disobedience were severe but also symbolic. Stealing could lead to public humiliation or mutilation, but more often, social discipline worked through shame and collective responsibility. If a member of your elu disobeyed the rules, everyone bore some of the guilt. This subtle peer pressure kept communities in check. And yet, for all its rigidity, the Inca system had a deeply human logic. People who could not work, like the elderly, the sick, or widows, were provided for by their elu or by the state. Orphans were adopted into the labor system. Disaster relief was not optionally, was organized. The Inca understood that resilience required planning. Perhaps the most fascinating feature of Inca governance was how invisible it often was. There was no standing police force in the modern sense. No written laws posted in the streets. Control came through structure, custom, and surveillance. Officials were always watching. Loyalty was cultivated early, and dissent was rare, though it did happen. Ultimately, the Inca governed not by brute force, but through an astonishing level of administrative foresight. They built an empire with no wheels, no iron, no currency, and yet it moved with clockwork precision. It was a system deeply rooted in reciprocity. The people worked for the state, and in return, the state fed, clothed, protected, and honored them. Until, of course, it was all undone, might by mismanagement, not by rebellion, but by foreign conquest. But for a time, Tawantinsuyu stood, and in its bones, its roads, and its records of string and silence, we still glimpsed the brilliance of its rule. To understand the soul of the Inca Empire, one must step beyond its architecture and administration and into the realm of the sacred. For the Inca religion was not a separate aspect of life, was life. Every field planted, every battle fought, every child born or illness endured was bound to unseen forces. The empire's power did not just rest on stone or sword, but on a shimmering world of gods, spirits, and rituals. At the heart of Inca belief stood Inti, the sun god, source of light, warmth, and life. Inti was more than just a celestial being. He was the father of the royal line, the divine ancestor of the Sapa Inca. To serve the emperor was to serve the sun, and to serve the sun meant giving thanks, offerings, and sometimes even lives. The Inca world was filled with gods, large and small. Inti ruled the heavens, but Pachamama, the earth mother, ruled the soil and the harvest. Illapa, the thunder god, brought rains or droughts. Each mountain, or APU, was considered a living spirit. Sacred places, called wakas, could be anything: a rock, a spring, an oddly shaped tree. They were not symbols of the divine. They were the divine. Religion and empire were inseparable. Every conquest was also a spiritual one. New lands meant new walkers, new gods to be acknowledged and, if possible, absorbed. The Inca rarely destroyed local gods. Instead, they honored them, but always made it clear that Inti and the Sapa Inca were above them. Temples were built in conquered cities. Priests were trained in the imperial cult. The state religion flowed outward like light from the sun, warming and binding the empire together. One of the most sacred places in all the empire was the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun in Cusco. Its walls were once covered in sheets of beaten gold, reflecting light so brilliantly that it must have seemed as though the sun itself had descended to earth. Inside, mummies of past emperors sat on golden thrones, attended by priests as if still alive. Offerings of food and chicha beer were brought to them. Their decisions were consulted. They were not relics, they were ancestors, and ancestors were ever present. Death, in the Inca world, was not an end. It was a transition. And so the dead were mummified, revered, and often paraded in public ceremonies. These ancestors, especially the royal dead, continued to own land, receive tribute, and maintain their estates. Their descendants formed panucas, royal kin groups responsible for their upkeep. This meant that political power could be eternal, divided between the living and the embalmed. Rituals were a constant part of life. The Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun, was one of the most important ceremonies of the year. Held at the winter solstice in June, thousands gathered in Cusco to celebrate the rebirth of the sun. There was dancing, feasting, and sacrifice. Llamas were often offered, and in certain solemn moments, human sacrifice, especially of children, was carried out. These were not acts of cruelty, but of reverence. Chosen children, known as kapak hacha, were raised in privilege, selected for purity, and honored as messengers to the gods. Their remains, found atop freezing Andean peaks, tell stories of rituals that reached into the sky. Priests played a central role in mediating between the human and the divine. High priests, called Vilak Yumu, oversaw state ceremonies, while lower priests maintained local shrines and temples. Divination was common through the reading of coca leaves, watching the behavior of animals, or interpreting the movement of smoke or water. Dreams were not private, they were messages. Illness might mean the anger of the spirit, and healing required ritual, not just medicine. Even architecture reflected religious belief. Many Inca temples were aligned with astronomical events, the solstices, the rising of specific stars, the movement of constellations. The great ceremonial center, at just above Cusco, was more than a fortress. Its massive zigzagging walls mirrored lightning, symbol of the city itself was designed in the shape of a puma, a sacred animal. The Inca also practiced pilgrimage. Devotees would travel to remote shrines, often high in the mountains, to make offerings. Some of these sites, like Choqueque Rio, and rivaled even Machu Picchu in spiritual importance. These journeys reinforced both religious faith and imperial unity, tying people across vast distances to a common sacred geography. And yet, Inca religion was not static. It evolved, absorbed, and adapted. When the Spanish arrived, they found a people whose worldview was so deeply woven into daily life that it was difficult to separate the spiritual from the secular. This made conversion both challenging and urgent, for to dismantle the Inca religion was to dismantle the empire itself. The Spanish quickly stripped the gold from Coricancha and built a church atop its foundation. They outlawed the rituals, burned the mummies, and silenced the priests. But belief cannot be so easily erased. Many Andean communities continued to venerate their walkers in secret. Syncretism emerged, Christian saints were matched with old gods, and native festivals took on new forms under Catholic names. Even today, in high Andean villages, echoes of the old religion remain. Offerings of coca, maize beer, and llama fat are still made to the mountains. The sun is still honored, the ancestors still remembered. The Inca gods may no longer rule an empire, but they have not disappeared. In the shimmering gold of their temples, in the silence of mountaintop tombs, and in the quiet prayers of those who still walk ancient paths, the spiritual power of the Inca endures. When one imagines a great empire, it's easy to picture grand palaces, intricate roads, or bustling cities. But none of that can be built or defended without an army. And while the Inca are often remembered for their engineering and administration, they were also formidable warriors. The Inca army, disciplined and deeply strategic, was the force that turned a small Andean kingdom into a sprawling imperial superpower. At its height, the Inca Empire stretched over 3,000 miles, from modern-day Colombia in the north to Chile in the south. Controlling such vast and varied terrain from deserts to jungles to high altitude peaks required more than just brute force. It required organization, supply chains, and above all, loyalty. Military service was not optional. It was a duty expected of all men of fighting age. But the Inca didn't rely on a permanent standing army. Instead, they could rapidly mobilize large forces from across the empire. Through the MITA system, a labor tax that included military service. When summoned, thousands would leave their farms and homes to fight under imperial banners. Despite lacking iron or steel, the Inca were not primitive fighters. Their weaponry was shaped by their environment and enemies. They used slings waraka to hurl stones with deadly speed, wooden clubs with star-shaped heads, bronze-tipped spears, and bolus-weighted cords thrown to entangle limbs. Their warriors wore padded armor, wooden helmets often reinforced with metal or animal hide, and carried shields made from wood and woven fibers. The power of the Inca army, however, was not just in weapons, it was in strategy. Every campaign was preceded by careful planning. Spies, known as tokoyikok, gathered intelligence on rival tribes or rebellious regions. Diplomacy was often the first weapon. Envoys offered local leaders gifts, prestige, and a place in the imperial system in exchange for peaceful submission. Many accepted, but if they refused, the Inca responded decisively. Military campaigns were launched with logistical precision. Roads built for warfare, the same ones later used by Spanish conquerors, allowed troops to move quickly. Food and supplies were stockpiled in kolkas or storehouses along the way. Messages were carried by chasqui relay runners who could communicate across hundreds of miles in a matter of days. Armies were divided into units based on their region of origin. This organization served both tactical and psychological purposes. Commanders could track performance, and soldiers were motivated to bring honor to their region. In some cases, the Inca placed trusted elite soldiers at the front, while recently conquered or suspect groups were pushed to the rear where they could be better monitored. Battles often began with rituals and displays. Warriors dressed in distinct regional attire, carrying standards and banners of their provinces. The clash itself was brutal. Stone weapons demanded strength and proximity. The terrain, steep slopes, narrow valleys, and high plains meant that every battle was also a test of endurance. Victory wasn't just about who had more troops, but who controlled the high ground and who had better knowledge of the land. Once a region was conquered, the Inca didn't merely walk away. They imposed a system of integration. Local elites were often spared, invited to Cusco to learn Inca customs and language, then sent back as representatives of imperial order. Soldiers settled in newly conquered lands, and loyal colonists were moved in. This strategy, called mitma, helped ensure long-term control. The Inca also employed psychological warfare. They were known to parade defeated kings through cities, humbling them publicly before reinstalling them as client rulers. Sometimes they destroyed enemy idols, relocating them to Cusco, symbolically transferring divine favor to the Inca. Their military might peaked under rulers like Pachacuti and his son Tupac, Inca Yupanqui, who expanded the empire through a blend of military genius and administrative follow-through. Under their reign, the Inca reached the borders of modern Ecuador and Argentina, incorporating millions into their fold. But the strength of the Inca military had a shadow side. It depended heavily on the emperor's direct authority. Loyalty was to the Sapa Inca, not a general military class or independent command structure. When the empire was strong and unified, this was effective. But when succession crises occurred, such as the brutal civil war between Atahualpa and Huascar, the army split as well. Brother fought brother, and the very force that once held the empire together helped tear it apart. Moreover, the lack of long-range weaponry, cavalry, or metal armor would eventually prove fatal. When the Spanish arrived with horses, steel swords, and firearms, even a massive Inca force could not withstand the shock. Despite outnumbering their enemies dramatically, the Inca soldiers had no defense against mounted troops or bullets. Yet the Spaniards themselves wrote with awe about the discipline and bravery of Inca warriors. At the Battle of Ollantaytambo, Manco Inca's troops held off Spanish advances with stone walls, clever traps, and a burning of the surrounding plain to trap mounted soldiers. Even in retreat, the Inca fought with tenacity and cohesion, and they never stopped resisting. Long after the fall of Cusco, remnants of the Inca army retreated deep into the jungle to establish a final refuge. There, for nearly 40 years, they launched raids and defied Spanish control. It was a final chapter of Inca military defiance, ghost army fighting for a lost empire. The Inca military machine was not built on conquest alone. It was sustained by a belief in divine mission, strategic brilliance, and collective effort. It conquered without iron, ruled without writing, and endured in memory long after its defeat. In the end, the story of the Inca army is not just one of battles, but of transformation. Through war, the Inca reshaped the Andes. Through discipline and unity, they forged an empire. And through the memory of resistance, they left a legacy that still echoes through the mountains they once ruled. In the vast stretch of the Andean mountains, amidst ridges cloaked in cloud and valleys carved by ancient rivers, there rose a city unlike any other in the Americas. The Inca called it Cusco. They believed it was the very center of the universe, the navel of the world. And in many ways, it was. Cusco was not only the capital of the Inca Empire, it was its spiritual heart, its administrative brain, and its architectural masterpiece. From this single city, a civilization organized the affairs of millions, sent armies marching across thousands of miles, and shaped the destiny of an entire continent. To understand the Incas, one must understand Cusco. The layout of the city itself was symbolic. From the sky, or more realistically, from high ridges, it took the shape of a puma, a sacred animal in Andean belief. Its head was the fortress, of its body composed of the main city blocks, and its tail, where the rivers met. Streets were narrow but clean, often paved with stone and sloped for drainage. Walls were made of finely cut andesite, so precisely fitted that even a knife blade could not slip between the stones. No mortar was used. The stones held together by weight, shape, and craftsmanship, a technique called ashlar masonry. This building style gave Inca structures remarkable resilience. Many of these same walls remain standing today, even after centuries of earthquakes that have crumbled modern concrete. In the very center of Cusco was the Hoquipata, the Great Square. It served as a ceremonial stage, a gathering place, and the beginning point of the four great roads that led to the empire's corners. In Quichua, these quarters were called Saya Shenchasuyu to the northwest, Antisuyu to the northeast, Colasuyu to the southeast, and Contasuyu to the southwest. All roads led back to Cusco. Literally, along the edge of the square stood the Coricancha, or Temple of the Sun, arguably the most sacred building in the entire empire. Its outer walls were once covered in sheets of gold that gleamed in the Andean sunlight, said to represent the rays of Inti, the sun god. Inside, golden statues and altars paid homage to celestial forces. Yet it was not just a temple, it was an astronomical observatory, calendar hub, and political statement. To step inside was to walk into the empire's soul. Attached to the Coricancha was the Ecloacy, or House of the Chosen Women. Here, select girls from across the empire were brought to be trained as priestesses, weavers, or attendants to the elite. Some would eventually marry nobles or serve in rituals. Others would be prepared for offerings to the gods, human sacrifices, in rare but deeply meaningful ceremonies. Life in the Ecloacy was cloistered, controlled, and filled with symbolism. Throughout Cusco, one found a careful blend of ritual and bureaucracy. Government buildings, temples, and elite residences followed the same masonry style: sharp, clean, earthquake-resistant, but their function determined their access and decoration. Inca nobility lived in compounds with multiple courtyards, storage rooms, and ritual spaces. Water channels ran through parts of the city, not only for sanitation, but also for sacred purposes, purification before ceremonies and offerings. The Inca emperor, or Sapa Inca, resided in grand palaces, constructed after his reign. This was an important cultural rule. No emperor could live in the palace of his predecessor. Each ruler's palace was like a private court and administrative hub, which became a kind of living mausoleum after his death. His mummified body would be tended by servants and brought out for festivals. Thus, the dead continued to live within the rhythms of the capital. But Cusco was not only for royalty. It was also home to administrators, craftsmen, religious specialists, and laborers. The city was cosmopolitan in its own way. As the empire expanded, people from across the Andes were resettled in or around Cusco, bringing their languages, textiles, customs, and gods. This served two purposes. It increased loyalty to the empire and turned Cusco into a microcosm of Tawantinsuyu, the Inca world. One of the most remarkable features of Cusco was its urban infrastructure. Roads radiated outward like veins. Aqueducts and fountains ensured fresh water. There were storage facilities for grain and dried meat, platforms for public announcements, locations for rituals tied to the sun, moon, stars, and mountains. The city was as much an instrument of empire as it was a home for its people. Above the city loomed a fortress and ceremonial complex built with massive stone blocks, weighing over 100 tons. The way they were cut and moved remains a subject of fascination. No wheels, no beasts of burden, only human labor and genius guarded the city and symbolized its strength. It was here that Manco Inca made his final stand against the Spanish, launching a siege that nearly expelled them. And it was here that Spanish accounts record some of the fiercest fighting of the conquest. The fortress was eventually taken, but not easily. Its fall marked the symbolic end of Cusco as an Inca capital. After the Spanish conquest, much of the city was dismantled or repurposed. Temples became churches. Palaces became colonial homes. But the Inca foundations remained too strong to be removed. Even today, modern buildings in Cusco sit atop Inca stonework. The past supports the present. Walking through Cusco today, you can still trace the ancient paths. You can see the stone walls, feel the weight of time, and imagine the rituals that once echoed through the plazas. The city lives on, not just in ruins, but in memory, in rhythm, and in reverence. It was more than a city. It was a blueprint for order, a monument to divine authority, a message in stone. This was Cusco, the navel of the world. High in the Andes, where the air thins and the night sky gleams with crystalline clarity, the Inca turned their gaze upward. Without glass lenses, telescopes, or modern instruments, they studied the stars and the movement of celestial bodies with remarkable precision. To them, the sky was not just a map, it was a sacred text, a calendar, and a message from the gods. In a world without writing, the Incas recorded time and marked events not through books, but through the alignment of stones, the play of sunlight and shadow, and the choreography of stars above their temples. Astronomy, though not named as such, was central to their world. Let us begin with the sun. The Inca people worshipped Inti, the sun god, as the source of life and power. The emperor, the Sapa Inca, was considered a direct descendant of Inti, and solar cycles shaped the religious, political, and agricultural rhythms of the empire. To track the sun, the Incas constructed solar observatories, some of which remain standing today. In Cusco, at the Coricancha, golden panels once lined the walls to reflect the first rays of the morning sun during the sun. Priests would observe when and where the sunlight fell within chambers, creating a solar calendar through architecture. Further from the capital, in places like Machu Picchu, we find the Intihuatana stone, its name meaning the hitching post of the sun. This carved granite pillar, placed with exquisite precision, casts no shadow at noon during the equinox. Researchers believe the stone was used to mark important solar events, solstices, equinoxes, and zeniths, which guided everything from planting cycles to religious festivals. The Incas were keen observers of solar zenith passages, a phenomenon that occurs in the tropics when the sun passes directly overhead. They marked these occasions with ceremonies, considering them moments when the barrier between the earthly and divine was thinnest. It was not just about astronomy, it was about communion with the gods. But it wasn't just the sun. The Incas also tracked the moon, stars, planets, and most intriguingly, dark constellations, the spaces between stars, rather than the stars themselves. Unlike the European tradition of connecting bright points of light, Andean astronomers found meaning in the black spaces within the Milky Way. In the band of stars known as Mayu, or the Milky Way, they saw animals, llamas, foxes, serpents emerging from the void. The llama in the sky is perhaps the best known, a constellation formed not from stars, but from the dark shapes between them. This inverted perception of the cosmos was deeply spiritual, seeing both form and absence as messages from the universe. These dark constellations were not simply imaginative figures. They were linked to agricultural calendars, seasonal rains, and myths. When the llama appeared overhead, it was time for the herds to breed. When the serpent crept into view, the rainy season approached. The heavens offered not just beauty, but guidance. Timekeeping, too, was guided by the stars. The Incas divided the year into lunar months, adjusted by solar observation. They used pillar alignments like those found near Cusco and in sacred valleys to trace the sunrise and sunset across the horizon. These seeks, or sightlines, were not only spiritual, they were practical tools for measuring time. One remarkable site is Chanquillo, a 2,300-year-old complex predating the Inca, but likely influencing them. Their 13 stone towers line a ridge like a jagged spine. When viewed from specific points, the rising or setting sun appears to move between the towers, marking solstices and equinoxes with astonishing accuracy. Though not built by the Inca, it shows the long Andean tradition of skywatching. The Incas also observed Venus, which they associated with war and change. They tracked its heliacal its first appearance before dawn, after a period of invisibility, and incorporated it into ritual cycles. Venus held different meanings to different cultures in the Andes, but all agreed it mattered. Even eclipses did not go unnoticed. A solar eclipse might have been seen as a disruption in Inti's favor, a moment of fear or divine warning. In response, priests would fast, sacrifices would be made, and rituals conducted to restore cosmic balance. Yet, perhaps most impressive is that all of this was achieved without writing. The Incas did not inscribe star maps on parchment or chisel almanacs into stone. Instead, they encoded time and sky into architecture, ritual, myth, and memory. Knowledge passed from priest to apprentice, from astronomer to engineer. Quipus, the famous knotted cords, may have recorded astronomical data, but this is still a matter of scholarly debate. What is certain is that the Inca understanding of time and cosmos was deeply integrated into every aspect of life. The year revolved around major festivals, most of which were timed by solar events. The most important was Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun, held during the winter solstice. Nobles fasted beforehand, offerings were made, and on the shortest day of the year, the empire renewed its bond with the sun. It was both scientific and sacred. At the opposite end was Capac Raymi, the summer solstice celebration, where noble boys underwent initiation rites. Again, the cosmos dictated the calendar, just as it shaped agriculture, politics, and spirituality. Today, archaeologists continue to uncover more about the Incas' astronomical knowledge. Through analysis of site alignments, artifact placements, and the orientation of temples and windows, we are learning that nearly every Inca construction had a relationship to the sky. It is a reminder that their empire, though built of stone, was designed in dialogue with the stars. They may not have had observatories like Galileo or telescopes like Kepler, but the Inca understood the universe in their own way. Through light and shadow, stone and sun, season and ritual, their knowledge was woven into fabric, etched into memory, and aligned with the heavens. In the thin air of the Andes, science was never separate from spirit. It was the cosmos brought to Earth, one sunrise, one solstice, one constellation at a time. Imagine standing on a narrow mountain trail that clings to a cliffside, thousands of meters above sea level. Below, clouds drift through deep canyons. Above, the Andean sun casts long shadows over stone steps, carved directly into the rock. This is not a path for the faint of heart, but it was once part of the largest and most sophisticated road system in pre-Columbian America, and it was built not by wheel, nor pulled by beasts of burden, but shaped by hands, stone, and sheer will. This is the Capicone, the royal road of the Inca Empire, a network of over 40,000 kilometers of roads, bridges, causeways, and tunnels. It connected mountains, jungles, and deserts, binding an empire that stretched from modern-day Colombia to central Chile. Unlike the Roman roads that inspired such awe in Europe, the Inca roads were not built for carts or chariots. There were no wheels in Inca transport, no horses until the Spanish arrived. Instead, goods and messages moved by foot, carried by people, and by llamas over long distances. The roads had to adapt to the land, rather than force the land to conform. And the Andes were not forgiving. Some sections ran along coastal plains, smooth and dry. Others ascended jagged peaks, where the air thinned and the weather turned quickly. In the high Andes, where snow falls even in summer, the Inca carved steps, paved trails, and anchored rope bridges over sheer drops. The most famous road, the Camino Real, ran north to south through Cusco, the imperial capital, like a spine. From there, secondary roads branched out like ribs, connecting valleys, cities, military posts, and storehouses. Some routes passed through sacred landscapes and pilgrimage sites, turning travel into ritual. Every stretch was purposeful. Roads led to tambos, or roadside inns, spaced roughly a day's journey apart. These provided shelter for messengers, soldiers, and state officials. Alongside the tambos, the Inca built calcas storehouses filled with dried food, tools, textiles, and weapons. These facilities made long-distance travel and provisioning possible in a vast, mountainous empire. Perhaps the most remarkable element of the road system was the Chasqui relay runners. Young men trained to run fast and far. Positioned every few kilometers, they passed messages oral, or on Quipus across the empire at astonishing speeds. A message could travel hundreds of kilometers in a day, faster than mounted messengers in medieval Europe. The chasqui also carried fresh goods, royal announcements, and sometimes even fish from the coast to Cusco, still cool when it arrived. Their relay system was a feat of logistics and human endurance, woven seamlessly into the road infrastructure. The engineering itself was equally impressive. Roads were adapted to the local environment. In desert areas, they were often built with raised beds and stone borders to prevent drifting sand. In the mountains, retaining walls, drainage channels, and stepped paths protected against erosion. Where rivers interrupted the journey, the Inca built suspension bridges, using braided grass cables to create crossings that could span 30 meters or more. These bridges were renewed annually by local communities in a ritual of labor and continuity, a tradition that survives in parts of Peru today. Some of these roads were ceremonial, too. Pilgrims walked certain paths barefoot, traveling to shrines like Colcampita or high-altitude temples, where offerings were made to mountain deities. The roads guided not only trade and governance, but also spiritual journeys. Yet for all their function and grandeur, these roads were not open to everyone. While the empire's subjects could use local segments, many key routes were reserved for state business, military movement, messengers, and officials. The Capicone was a symbol of imperial power, reflecting the reach of Cusco's authority. When the Spanish arrived, they were astonished. They marched their horses and carts across stretches of Inca roads and marveled at the bridges. They wrote of the straightness of the routes, the precision of the stones, the vertical ascents that seemed to defy gravity. Some colonial officials even used the roads for their own campaigns, recognizing their utility. But they didn't maintain them. Without the centralized labor system of the Inca and the communal obligations of the Alu, the road system began to fall into disrepair. Grass grew through the stones, bridges collapsed, chasqui no longer ran. Today, archaeologists and conservationists are uncovering and restoring segments of the Capicone, now recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. In rural areas, farmers still walk parts of it to reach remote fields. Some bridges have been rebuilt by hand, exactly as they were centuries ago. The roads of the Inca tell us much more than just where people traveled. They reveal a civilization that was deeply connected across terrain, across cultures, and across time. They show us an empire that understood logistics, planning, and the importance of movement. They speak of runners whose footsteps echoed across mountains, and of emperors who could command the far reaches of their domain without writing a single letter. Most of all, they remind us that connectivity is not a modern invention. Long before highways and satellites, there were stone paths in the Andes, binding villages to valleys, valleys to cities, cities to the sacred heart of an empire. And in that stone still firm beneath the feet of those who walk it lies the enduring power of the Inca road. Picture yourself high in the Andes, in a small Inca settlement, where the air is cool and thin, where terraced fields step down the mountainside, and smoke curls gently from stone houses. A young man lies on a woven mat, fevered, breathing shadowily. His family gathers near, and into the room steps a Hamuka, traditional Inca healer, draped in a cloak of alpaca wool, with a pouch of herbs and a small, smooth knife of obsidian. He brings with him the wisdom of generations. Inca medicine was not superstition, nor was it fully divorced from the spiritual. It blended observation, ritual, and the natural pharmacopoeia of the Andes into a deeply practical system of healing. Illness, in Inca belief, was often a sign of imbalance either in the body, or between the patient and the spirits or ancestors. Healing was as much about restoring harmony as curing symptoms. The Incas had no written language, so their medical knowledge was passed orally through memory, apprenticeship, and sacred trust. Many healers, especially in rural areas, were also spiritual leaders. They knew which herbs soothed stomach pain, which roots reduced fever, which leaves numbed pain. Coca leaves were used not just for stamina, but as a mild anesthetic. Chicha fermented corn, beer was employed as a cleanser and mild sedative. Some medical practices would astonish modern observers. The Incas were highly skilled at trepanations, surgically removing a portion of the skull to relieve pressure, treat head injuries, or perhaps as a ritual act. Archaeological evidence shows that many patients survived, with bone regrowth indicating healing. Their survival rate for such procedures exceeded that of European battlefield surgeons centuries later. Wounds were cleaned with alcohol or vinegar, bound with bandages made from llama wool or plant fibers, and treated with antiseptic herbs like muna and aquira. For bone fractures, splints were carved from wood or fashioned from woven reeds. Though they had no microscopes, no concept of germs, Inca healers understood contagion in practical terms. Quarantine and isolation were practiced instinctively during outbreaks. In some areas, smallpox and other introduced diseases were met with swift, organized responses, though, tragically, these efforts were no match for the devastation European epidemics would unleash. But medicine was only half the story. The Inca relationship with the dead was profound, reverent, and enduring. Mummification, particularly of nobles, rulers, and priests, was not just a funerary rite, but a way of continuing a person's presence among the living. Mummies were not buried and forgotten. They were placed in seated positions, wrapped in layers of fine textiles, adorned with personal items, and housed in chulpas above ground, tombs or sacred caves. These ancestral mummies were visited, consulted, and even fed. Offerings of maize, coca, and chicha were left for them. During festivals, they might be paraded through the streets, dressed in royal garments. Inca rulers didn't just rule while living, they remained spiritual authorities, even in death. Their estates continued to operate, their servants maintained their households, and their lineage remained politically potent. This deep connection between medicine and mummification wasn't separate from governance, it was an extension of the Inca worldview, in which life and death were not opposites, but linked states in a continuum. Ancestors, gods, and the living all existed in a layered world, where reciprocity was sacred. To care for the dead was to honor that bond. To heal the living was to restore balance. The mummification process varied based on status and region. In coastal areas, natural desiccation aided preservation. In the highlands, bodies were often dried in cold, dry air. Some were treated with smoke, resin, or salt. Limbs were tied in fetal position, symbolizing rebirth. The best preserved mummies, such as those discovered on mountain summits like Lulaco, remained remarkably intact for centuries, right down to their hair and garments. These mountaintop burials were not ordinary. They were ritual sacrifices, known as copa-coca ceremonies of offering meant to appease mountain gods, ensure fertility, or mark significant events. Children, carefully chosen and ritually prepared, were honored with precious garments and goods, then left to freeze in sacred solitude. To modern sensibilities, this can be difficult to comprehend. But in the Inca worldview, this was not cruelty, it was transcendence. Those sacrificed became intercessors, elevated to dwell among the deities. Their lives were not ended. They were transformed into beings of power. Modern science has learned much from these practices. CT scans of Inca mummies have revealed intact organs, braided hair, undigested last meals. In some, traces of coca and alcohol confirm ritual sedation. These findings bridge the ancient and modern worlds, shedding light not just on death but on how the Inca approached health, spirit, and society. Inca medicine and mummification remind us of a civilization that was remarkably adaptive, scientifically curious, and deeply spiritual. They recognized the healing power of nature, the value of experience, and the enduring ties between generations. They treated the human body with both technical precision and sacred care. Today, their wisdom lives on not only in archaeological finds, but in the practices of Andean communities, who still turn to curanderos, still chew coca leaves, still honor their ancestors with food and prayer. In every remedy and every wrapped mummy, we find echoes of a people who believed that to care for life was to respect death, and to serve the body was to serve the soul. High in the rugged folds of the Andes, where most would see only cliffs, valleys, and shifting stone, the Inca saw a possibility. They didn't merely adapt to this landscape, they mastered it, and they did so with a precision that still leaves modern engineers quietly astonished. The legacy of Inca engineering is written in stone, quite literally. From Cusco to Machu Picchu, from the agricultural terraces of Moray to the desert lines of Nazca, their accomplishments stretch across mountains, deserts, and forests. Each site tells a story not of brute labor alone, but of advanced planning, careful observation, and a culture that revered harmony with the earth. Let's begin with one of their greatest strengths. Unlike other great civilizations, the Inca built without mortar. Instead, they perfected a technique known as ashlar masonry, cutting stones so precisely that not even a blade of grass could fit between them. Huge stones, some weighing over 100 tons, were shaped to fit together in irregular, jigsaw-like patterns that absorbed seismic shock. These walls were not only durable but flexible, able to shift and settle during earthquakes without collapsing. Even more remarkable is that the Incas did this without iron tools or wheels. They used bronze chisels, stone hammers, and patience. Transporting stones over miles of mountainous terrain required ingenuity. Ropes, wooden rollers, ramps, and massive teams of workers combined with sheer will moved the unmovable. Their temples, like the Coricancha in Cusco, revealed the sacred geometry behind the stone. Coricanchuans coated in sheets of gold was the most important temple of the empire, dedicated to Inti, the sun god. Its walls curve with the land's contours, and its orientation aligns with solstices and celestial events. When the Spanish arrived and destroyed the temple, they built a church atop it. Earthquakes have since damaged the church. The Inca walls below, still standing. Beyond temples, the Inca transformed the very landscape with their terraces and canals. Facing steep mountain slopes, they carved horizontal platforms that not only created arable land, but prevented erosion and improved irrigation. These, or terraces, used layers of gravel, sand, and soil to control moisture and support crops in wildly different altitudes and climates. Their aqueducts and canals funneled glacial melt from mountain springs to fields and cities. Some aqueducts ran for kilometers, maintaining a gentle gradient to keep water flowing smoothly. The Incas studied water like a living thing, channeling it, redirecting it, even honoring it with ceremonial fountains. At southeast of Cusco, you can still walk among gently burbling canals that once nourished royal gardens and ritual basins. But nowhere is their engineering genius more poetically expressed than at Machu Picchu. Perched nearly 8,000 feet above sea level, this royal estate was built on a narrow mountain ridge with virtually no flat surface. And yet, it includes hundreds of buildings, dozens of terraces, and a sophisticated drainage system that keeps the site stable to this day. Here, water was as carefully managed as stone. A network of underground drains and surface canals channels rainwater away from buildings and paths. This hydraulic planning prevented landslides, erosion, and flooding dangers that could have erased the city within a few years. Instead, it has survived for centuries. At Ollantaytambo, a fortress temple complex with massive stepped terraces, the stones are even larger than at Machu Picchu. These blocks, over 50 tons, were transported from a quarry across the river valley. They had to be dragged uphill, floated, or rolled across carefully built causeways. The sheer effort involved suggests not just engineering skill, but a vast, organized labor force, likely part of the meta system, in which citizens contributed labor to the state. And then there are the roads. The Capicone, or Royal Road System, stretched over 24,000 miles, connecting deserts, jungles, and mountains, built for messengers, armies, and trade. It included rope, bridges strung across canyons, stone steps cut into cliff faces, and tambo sway stations, stocked with food and shelter. The Incas never developed the wheel for transport. Yet their network was so advanced that messengers chasqui could relay a message across the empire in just days. What makes all this more impressive is the absence of written blueprints or advanced tools. Inca architects relied on knowledge passed orally, measured by Quipus, and guided by a cosmological sense of order. They aligned structures with the sun, the stars, the mountains, believing that architecture was a form of communication between the earth and the heavens. Modern archaeologists continue to learn from Inca techniques. Engineers study their terraces to understand sustainable agriculture in difficult climates. Seismologists analyze their walls to design earthquake-resistant structures. And historians marvel at how such monumental achievements could arise in a society without writing, without wheels, without iron. To walk among these ruins is to feel a kind of silence, not empty, but watchful. The stones fit so tightly they seem alive, as if breathing slowly beneath your feet. The terraces still cradle soil. The water still flows. The past, here, is not buried. It whispers. The Incas built with eternity in mind, not to defy nature, but to join with it. In every wall, aqueduct, and carved stairway, there is a message. This was made not to dominate the earth, but to honor it. And more than half a millennium later, their work still stands. To understand the Inca Empire, you must step not only into their cities and roads, but into their way of seeing the world. For the Incas, religion was not something separate from everyday life. It was the air, the water, the land beneath their feet. It shaped the way they built their cities, planted their crops, and made decisions in war and peace. In short, religion was the architecture of reality. The Incas practiced a deeply animistic and polytheistic belief system, in which natural forces and sacred places were alive with spiritual power. Mountains, rivers, stones, even certain animals were considered walkers, holy things, imbued with divine essence. These walkers were not merely symbolic. They were treated with offerings, rituals, and sometimes even sacrifices. At the center of their belief system stood Inti, the sun god, considered the ancestor of the ruling Inca dynasty. The emperor, the Sapa Inca, was said to be the living son of Inti, which granted him divine authority. Inti was more than a deity. He was a source of warmth, life, and legitimacy. The Inca calendar revolved around his path across the sky, with major festivals marking solstices and equinoxes. The most important of these celebrations was Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun. Held in June, at the winter solstice, it was a time of renewal and offerings. The people fasted, dressed in their finest garments, and watched as the emperor performed ceremonies to ensure the sun's return. Llamas were sacrificed, coca leaves burned, and the first corn of the harvest offered to the gods. But Inti was not the only celestial being of importance. There was Mama Quilla, the moon goddess, associated with fertility and the calendar. Illapa, the god of thunder, who brought both rain and war. Pachamama, the earth mother, was perhaps the most beloved, receiving daily thanks from farmers and travelers alike. Even the stars were organized into patterns called celestial animals, which guided the timing of agriculture and festivals. This cosmic order reflected itself in the physical world. The Inca capital of Cusco was laid out in the shape of a puma, a sacred animal, with each district and street aligned to cardinal points and astronomical events. The Temple of the Sun, Coricancha, was the most sacred building, lined with golden walls and dedicated to Inti. From it, invisible lines called Sikhs radiated outward, linking temples, shrines, and walkers in a vast spiritual map. Many of these shrines were located on mountains. The Incas believed that mountains, or apis, were living spirits, protectors of the people and intermediaries with the gods. They often made pilgrimages to these heights, leaving offerings such as textiles, food, and miniature figures. In some extreme cases, they even performed human sacrifices. These sacrifices, known as kapakoka, were rare and highly ceremonial. Chosen children, often from noble families, were raised in special conditions, treated with reverence, and led on long ritual journeys to remote mountaintops. There, they were given maize beer, placed in tombs with fine goods, and left to die from exposure or asphyxiation, far from cruel punishment. This was considered a sacred honor, joining the divine in the highest reaches of the world. The spiritual worldview of the Incas was also deeply reciprocal. The gods gave life, so humans must give back. Offerings were made before planting or building. Before drinking chicha, the corn beer, a small pour was always given to the groundan, offering to travelers left stones at mountain passes, thanking the apis for safe passage. Priests burned llama fat, textiles, and coca leaves as daily acts of respect and gratitude. At the state level, religion and politics were one. The priesthood was an arm of government, often drawn from the royal family. Oracles were consulted before military campaigns. Temple construction was an imperial affair. The Akla, or chosen women, lived in cloisters where they wove ritual textiles, brewed sacred drinks, and maintained the fires of the sun god. Some would become priestesses. Others would be given in marriage to nobility or to the gods. Perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of Inca religion was their concept of ancestor worship. The dead were not dead. Mummified emperors and nobles were kept in state, dressed, paraded, even consulted for advice. Their tombs were homes, their remains visited with food and drink. The past was not behind, it was still present. This reverence extended to time itself. The Inca saw time in dual forms: Pasha, the world or cosmos, and Pachacuti, a time of great upheaval or renewal. They believed history moved in cycles. A golden age had once existed, and would return again after a period of disorder. When the Spanish arrived, many Incas believed this return might be near. As the empire grew, the Inca imposed their gods on the conquered, but not by erasing local beliefs. Instead, they integrated them, adopting local wakas, recognizing native spirits, and folding them into the empire's spiritual structure. This flexibility helped unify a vast and diverse empire under a common religious framework. But this system was delicate. When the Spanish destroyed temples, desecrated shrines, and forced conversions to Christianity, they did more than impose a new faith. They unraveled the very order of the world. Even so, fragments of Inca belief persist. In the highlands of Peru and Bolivia, some farmers still give offerings to Pachamama, still greet the mountains with respect. The old gods, they say, are not gone, just sleeping. And perhaps, somewhere high in the Andes, a child mummy lies still on a mountain, dreaming of golden temples and eternal suns. It began, not with armies marching through mountain passes, but with a whisper of ships arriving on the distant coast. In 1532, a small band of Europeans stepped into the highlands of Peru, exhausted, armored, and utterly foreign. They were led by Francisco Pizarro, a former pig herder turned conquistador. Behind them lay a trail of conquest in Central America. Before them stood the sprawling Inca Empire, fractured by civil war and weakened by invisible enemies. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire is often told as a story of steel over stone, guns over spears. And yet, the reality is more complex, more tragic, more human, and more bewildering. By the time Pizarro arrived, the empire was in turmoil. The great Sapa, Inca, Huayna Capac, had died, not from battle, but from an illness likely introduced by European contact long before the Spanish themselves arrived. Smallpox and other diseases had swept through the Andean world, killing thousands, including many in the royal family. This sudden void of leadership ignited a brutal civil war between two half-brothers, Atahualpa, ruling from Quito in the north, and based in the capital Cusco. The war was long and bloody, with both sides unleashing fierce armies across the mountains and valleys. Atahualpa eventually triumphed, but just as he consolidated power, Pizarro entered the picture. The timing could not have been worse for the Incas, or better for the Spaniards. At Cajamarca, the Spanish and Inca worlds collided. Atahualpa, confident in his divine status and immense army, agreed to meet the Spanish under the assumption that they were mere ambassadors or traders. Instead, he walked into a trap. Pizarro's men, numbering fewer than 200, ambushed Atahualpa's entourage in a public square. Armed with steel swords, horses, and firearms, they slaughtered the Inca guards and captured the emperor alive. It was not just a military victory, it was a psychological one. To the Inca people, the Sapa Inca was the son of the sun, a divine being. His capture shattered the spiritual framework of the empire. Though Atahualpa was still alive, the spell had been broken. In captivity, Atahualpa attempted to buy his freedom. He famously offered to fill a room with gold and 2 more with silver, a ransom of staggering value. True to his word, the gold arrived. Intricate statues, ritual vessels, and ornaments melted down into ingots before ever reaching Spain. But the Spanish had no intention of releasing him. Atahualpa was eventually executed in a mock trial, accused of idolatry, fratricide, and rebellion. He was garroted, strangled with a rope. In 1533, the empire, already wounded, now bled from its spiritual heart. In the aftermath, the Spanish marched to Cusco, encountering little resistance. With the Inca leadership decapitated and the nobility fractured, they installed a puppet ruler, Manco Inca, and tried to rule through him. But the conquest was far from complete. Manco Inca eventually rebelled, leading a massive siege of Cusco in 1536. For months, his forces harried the Spanish, nearly pushing them out. Yet with reinforcements from Central America and a network of native allies, many of whom saw the Spanish as liberators from Inca rule, the rebellion faltered. Manco fled into the jungles of Vilcabamba, where a neo-Inca state survived in exile for several decades. It was not until 1572, with the capture and execution of the last Inca, Tupac Amaru, that the conquest was officially complete. But conquest is not merely the taking of land. It is the rewriting of stories, the reshaping of worlds. The Spanish brought with them not just weapons, but institutions. The church, colonial bureaucracy, forced labor systems like encomienda and meta, and a complete overhaul of Andean life. Temples were razed and replaced with churches. Walkers were declared demons. Inca nobility were baptized, renamed, and folded into a new colonial elite. The quipu, once the cords of memory, were abandoned. In their place came paper, ink, and Spanish law. And yet, the Inca spirit did not vanish. It went underground, into the songs of Quechua shepherds, into the rituals offered at roadside shrines, into the stories whispered by grandmothers. The memory of Atahualpa lived on as a symbol of betrayal and resistance. Even today, his name evokes a kind of mournful reverence. The conquest of the Inca Empire was not inevitable. It was the collision of accidents, disease, civil war, miscommunication, and ambition. A handful of outsiders reshaped an entire world, not because they were stronger or smarter, but because they arrived at precisely the wrong moment for the Incas. And so, the mountains that once echoed with golden hymns and royal processions now bore witness to something else: crosses, cannon fire, and the language of the conqueror. Yet beneath that surface, the Andes still whispered. The gods had not vanished. The sun still rose. And deep in the hearts of the people, the empire lived on. In the wake of the Spanish conquest, the Inca Empire did not simply vanish. Its stones remained in the walls of Cusco, in the roads that wound through the Andes, and in the memories of its people. Though the Sapa Inca was dead and the Spanish flag flew over the highlands, resistance persisted. It shifted form, from open warfare to cultural endurance, from organized rebellion to quiet refusal. The most visible center of this resistance was the Neo-Inca state of Vilcabamba. After the fall of Cusco, Manco Inca Yupanqui, once a Spanish puppet ruler, escaped the city and retreated into the mountainous jungles to the east. There, in a rugged and remote land, he built a new capital. It was not an empire, not as the Inca had known it, but it was a symbol, a defiant ember refusing to die out. For nearly 40 years, this hidden kingdom held out against the Spanish. From the misty forests of Vilcabamba Inca, warriors launched raids, ambushed supply trains, and preserved their language, rituals, and royal bloodlines. The jungle was both ally and armor, protecting them from horses and muskets. The Spanish called it a ghost kingdom. To the Inca people, it was the last beating heart of their world. This resistance was not just military, it was spiritual. Despite pressure from missionaries, many Quichua communities continued to honor the Apus, mountain spirits, and venerate ancient walkers, sacred stones, and springs. Some rituals went underground, others were woven subtly into Catholic celebrations. A festival for a saint might coincide with the solstice. A church might be built atop a temple, but deep beneath its foundations, old offerings still whispered. The last Inca ruler, Tupac Amaru, was captured in 1572. He was taken to Cusco, tried, and executed in the city square. His death marked the formal end of Inca resistance, but not the end of the Inca. Throughout the colonial era, many Andean communities retained a strong sense of identity. Spanish administrators often relied on local elites, known as Caracas, to govern their villages. These leaders, many of Inca descent, became intermediaries between empire and people. They preserved elements of Inca social structure, including communal farming and reciprocal labor systems. Meanwhile, Quichua, the language of the Inca, remained widely spoken. Though banned in formal governance and the church, it survived in markets, in family stories, and in lullabies. Even today, millions of people across Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador speak Quechua, or its sister tongues, a living echo of the empire. In the 18th century, a resurgence of Inca identity took form in a dramatic and ultimately tragic rebellion. A man named Gabriel Condorcanqui, claiming direct descent from the royal line, took the name Amaru II. In 1780, he launched a massive revolt against Spanish rule, decrying forced labor, high taxes, and the abuse of indigenous people. The rebellion swept across southern Peru, capturing the imagination of thousands. But the Spanish responded with brutal force. Tupac Amaru II was captured and executed in 1781, drawn and quartered in the plaza of Cusco. Yet his name would become immortal, invoked by future revolutionaries, and remembered in poetry, street names, and even modern political movements. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, as Peru gained independence and modernized, the legacy of the Inca took on new meaning. It became both a symbol of national pride and a tool for tourism. Sites like Machu Picchu, once hidden by forest, were rediscovered and reimagined. Scholars, explorers, and filmmakers began to romanticize the empire, often stripping away its complexities in favor of golden myths. And yet, for the descendants of the Inca, the story was not myth, it was inheritance. In villages high in the Andes, people still sow potatoes in raised fields shaped by their ancestors. They still offer chita to the earth and speak to the mountains as elders. The Inti Raymi festival, once banned, now revived, honors the sun god with music, dance, and ritual each year in Cusco. The spirit of the Inca Empire endures, not as a government, but as a culture, a memory, a pulse in the soil. Even in urban Peru, you'll find echoes: a street named after Atahualpa, a statue of Pachacuti, a market stall where an old woman sells coca leaves in woven cloth. The Inca are not gone. They never were. Their resistance was not merely to muskets or missionaries. It was to forgetting, and in that, they succeeded. When most people think of the Inca Empire, one name rises above all others: Machu Picchu. Perched on a saddle between two peaks, and cloaked in mist, it is one of the most iconic archaeological sites in the world. But Machu Picchu, remarkable as it is, was just one node in a vast network of engineering marvels scattered across the Andes. The Inca were master builders, and the landscape of their empire was dotted with lost cities, colossal stone walls, and impossibly constructed fortresses, many of which remain only partially understood today. Let us begin in just above Cusco. This enormous complex was not merely a military fort, though it had defensive features, but a ceremonial and symbolic center. What strikes most visitors are its stones. Massive boulders, some weighing over 100 tons, carved and fitted together with such precision that a blade of grass cannot slip between them. These stones were not held by mortar. Instead, they were shaped like puzzle pieces, locked into place by skill and patience. The technique, known as ashlar masonry, remains one of the most impressive feats of ancient engineering. Then, there is Ollantaytambo, a living town and ancient ruin combined. Its terraces cascade down the mountain like a green staircase. But it's the temple hill that holds mysteries. Giant pink granite blocks lie scattered, as if construction was halted midway, which it likely was, during the Spanish conquest. Each stone appears too large to have been moved by human force alone, and yet they were. Transported from a quarry across a river, over miles of rugged terrain. How? No one is certain. Theories abound. Ropes, logs, ramps. But no single answer satisfies all the questions. And then there's Choquequirao, sometimes called the sister city to Machu Picchu. It rests high above the river, accessible only by an arduous multi-day hike. Unlike Machu Picchu, Choquequirao remains relatively untouched by mass tourism. Yet, its scale is immense, possibly even larger than its famous sibling. Its terraced platforms spread like wings along the mountainside, and its ceremonial plazas suggest that it, too, was a royal estate, or perhaps a religious refuge during the empire's decline. Throughout the empire, the Inca did not just build for utility. Their architecture reflected spiritual and astronomical ideas. Many temples and cities aligned with solstice points or celestial events. The Coricancha, Cusco's golden temple, was once sheathed in sheets of gold and housed sacred relics, from mummies of past emperors to representations of the sun, moon, and stars. Spanish conquistadors later built a church atop its foundations, but the curved Inca walls remain. Resistant to time and tremor, they have outlasted the layers built above them. In the Sacred Valley, smaller sites like Moray showcase experimental agriculture and spiritual symbolism in tandem. Moray's concentric terraces form a deep amphitheater, each level with its own microclimate. Here, the Inca may have tested how crops adapted to altitude, a living laboratory of stone and soil. Nearby, the Salinares de Mara salt evaporation ponds terraced into a hillside are still used today, unchanged in method since Inca times. And high in the cloud forests and deep in remote valleys, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds of ruins, still hidden by vegetation, or only partially excavated. Some are known only by local shepherds or passing hikers. Others, like Vilcabamba, once served as bastions of resistance. Many of these sites are unnamed, undocumented, and crumbling. They remind us that the story of Inca architecture is far from complete. What ties all these constructions together is not just the scale, but the philosophy. The Inca believed in harmony with nature, and their cities reflected this. They did not dominate the landscape, they became part of it. Terraces conformed to slopes. Temples faced sunrise lines. Water channels followed the flow of the land. This was not just engineering. It was a worldview in which mountains were sacred beings, rivers were life-givers, and stone could hold spiritual essence. And these stones speak, even now. They tell of a civilization that carved empires from cliff faces, that bent granite to its will without iron tools, and that did so not by brute force alone, but with knowledge passed through generations. Today, as tourists stream into Machu Picchu, few realize they're standing in just one chapter of a vast architectural story. From the coast to the jungle, from the highlands to the fringes of the empire, the Inca left behind a map, etched in stone, waiting to be read. Stretching over 25,000 miles through some of the most rugged terrain on Earth, the Inca road system known as the Capac was not just an engineering triumph. It was the literal backbone of the empire, winding across deserts, scaling snow-covered passes, bridging ravines, and tunneling through rock. This ancient network united an empire without the wheel, without horses, and without written maps. The Inca Empire was vast, extending from what is now southern Colombia to central Chile, and the Capac tied it all together. These roads were essential for administration, trade, communication, and control. They allowed the Sapa Inca's orders to reach distant corners of the realm, and enabled armies to be deployed with remarkable speed. At its heart lay the city of Cusco, the empire's capital and spiritual axis. All major roads radiated out from this sacred center, like the spokes of a wheel, in intentional design, both symbolic and functional. The roads varied greatly in form. Some were wide, paved highways carved into the side of mountains, with stone retaining walls and carefully laid flagstones. Others were narrow paths cut into cliffs, or earthen trails winding through valleys. Yet all were part of a system meticulously maintained and patrolled. Suspension bridges, made from woven grass ropes, stretched across deep canyons, replaced annually in ritual ceremonies that still occur in places like Cusco, Peru. In other regions, stairways ascended impossibly steep inclines, their steps worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic. Travelers along the Capac often stopped at tambos, resting stations, or waypoints spaced roughly a day's journey apart. These structures provided food, shelter, and supplies to imperial messengers and officials. Some tambos were simple huts, others large complexes stocked with stored goods from nearby agricultural centers. In this way, the road system supported not just mobility, but logistical efficiency, ensuring grain, textiles, weapons, and information could flow uninterrupted. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of this network was its human-powered communication system, the chasqui. These highly trained messengers ran in relay, carrying messages and goods using Quipus knotted strings encoding information. A single message could travel up to 150 miles in one day, passed from runner to runner without pause. At each tambo, a fresh chasqui would receive the message and continue the route, making the Inca one of the fastest pre-modern societies at moving information. The Inca did all this without wheels, carts, or pack animals that could traverse roads efficiently. While llamas were used to carry light loads, much of the heavy transport and communication relied on human effort. And because the Andes were not friendly to wheeled vehicles, the roads were not designed with carts in mind. Instead, the Capac conformed to the land, taking the path of least resistance, or sometimes the most strategic one. Alongside the roads, archaeologists have discovered Intihuatana's ritual stones, shrines, and USNU platforms used for offerings and state ceremonies. The road wasn't just a means of travel, it was a spiritual conduit. Pilgrimages, processions, and royal tours all took place on these sacred highways. In some segments, the very stones used to pave the road were chosen for their symbolic significance. For the Inca, movement through space was also movement through spiritual layers. Many of the roads still exist today, buried beneath centuries of dust, swallowed by jungle, or incorporated into modern paths and highways. In remote Andean villages, locals still walk sections of the Capacone to reach markets, festivals, and homes. Some segments remain as intact as they were centuries ago, testament to their ingenious design and durable construction. The significance of this system was so great that the Spanish themselves used Inca roads during the conquest and colonial period. They marveled at their quality and scale, even as they dismantled much of the empire that created them. In recent years, UNESCO has recognized the Capacone as a World Heritage Site, emphasizing its role not just as a technological feat, but as a symbol of Pan-Andean identity. The Capacone reminds us that the Inca, though often seen as a lost civilization, were highly organized, deeply connected, and astonishingly mobile. Their empire may have stretched across mountains and rivers, deserts and jungles, but it was held together by stone paths trodden by runners, warriors, priests, and farmers. It was a living web of motion and message of pulse through the high Andes. So when we picture the Inca Empire, we should not only think of temples or terraced farms, but of roads long, silent, and enduring, still winding through the clouds where the empire once breathed. To understand the soul of the Inca Empire, one must look beyond its stone walls and terraced fields. At the heart of Inca society was a deeply spiritual worldview, one that intertwined gods with nature, rulers with deities, and rituals with the rhythms of the land. From mountaintop offerings to sun-drenched plazas, Inca ceremonies were not peripheral customs but central pillars that held the empire's moral and cosmic order together. The Inca believed in a living world, imbued with sacred forces. Inti, the sun god, reigned supreme. The divine father of the Sapa Inca himself. The moon, stars, mountains, rivers, and even stones were honored as walkers, sacred beings or objects that demanded reverence. This belief system, known today as anti-animism, dictated that harmony between humans and nature required ritual reciprocity, offerings, prayers, and sometimes sacrifice. One of the most solemn and profound expressions of this belief was the practice of copa, ritual human sacrifice. Contrary to popular imagination, these were not mass executions or scenes of chaos. Copa ceremonies were highly organized, deeply spiritual events that occurred at specific moments of great cosmic or political significance, such as a solar eclipse, the death of a Sapa Inca, or in times of crisis, like famine or war. The children selected for these sacrifices, often of noble birth, were considered pure, beautiful, and unblemished. Their families viewed the honor as a blessing, not a punishment. The children were prepared for months, given rich clothing, fine food, and a life of comfort. Eventually, they were taken on long pilgrimages to Apus, the high mountains considered sacred. Their priests performed rites that were meant to ensure their spirits joined the gods and protected the empire. In many cases, the children were gently drugged and left in stone burial chambers, high in the Andes, their bodies preserved by the cold. Modern discoveries, like the famous Ice Maiden, or the children of Lulaco, have revealed astonishingly intact mummies, faces serene, clothing undisturbed, offerings still beside them, but human sacrifice was rare. Far more common were rituals involving animals, coca leaves, textiles, and chicha beer. In the great plazas of Cusco, during festivals like Inti Raymi, the Festival of the Sun, priests led processions of dancers, singers, and dignitaries dressed in elaborate costumes. Golden effigies were paraded through the streets. Fires were lit. Hymns to Inti were sung in unison. The energy of the people was believed to nourish the gods as much as the offerings did. The Inca calendar was punctuated by such ceremonies. Each month brought its own festivals, tied to agricultural cycles and celestial events. In February, the Pachacuti marked the season of sowing and earth regeneration. In September, the Uma Raymi honored water and purification. The empire did not just function on force or bureaucracy. It moved with ritual time, aligning itself with the stars and soil. Ceremonies often took place at carefully chosen locations, mountaintops, springs, caves, or special stones, all wokas with spiritual significance. Priests would sprinkle cornmeal, burn jama fat, and chant prayers in Quechua, invoking the gods to bring rain, protect harvests, or cleanse disease. These events reinforced community bonds and reminded the people of their place in the cosmic hierarchy, below the gods, yet crucial in sustaining them. The role of the priesthood was paramount. These were not only spiritual leaders, but astronomers, historians, and advisors. They observed the skies from Intihuatana's sun-tracking stones, predicted solstices, and coordinated ceremonies that shaped the empire's rhythm. The Sapa Inca himself, considered the son of the sun, often took part, lending divine authority to state affairs. Religion and governance were not separate. They were one and the same. Even in death, rituals continued. The mummified remains of past rulers were treated as living beings. Brought out during festivals, they were given food, wine, and even consulted on political matters through mediums and priests. These malquis, or ancestral mummies, represented the unbroken line of divine rule and remained active members of society, a striking contrast to many modern views of death as a clear boundary. Spanish chroniclers were both fascinated and horrified by what they witnessed. The grandeur of the ceremonies, the solemnity of the sacrifices, and the devotion of the people challenged their preconceptions. Some wrote admiringly of the Incas' discipline and piety. Others condemned them as pagans. In time, Christian missionaries would outlaw Inca rituals and destroy many wakas. Though in remote regions, elements of Inca spirituality quietly survived, blending into local Catholic practices. Today, echoes of Inca ceremonies still resonate in the Andes. Festivals like Inti Raymi are reenacted in Cusco with music and ritual theater. Offerings to Pachamama Mother Earth are still made by Quechua communities during planting season and high on the mountain summits. Archaeologists continue to find the sacred footprints of a people who reached for the sky, not with conquest, but with ceremony. The Inca Empire may have fallen, but its rituals, solemn, beautiful, and deeply human, remind us of a time when empires were not only built on stone and steel, but on reverence, rhythm, and the belief that the divine moved through every stream, summit, and breath. The Inca Empire, once the largest and most complex civilization in the pre-Columbian Americas, did not collapse in a single, dramatic blow. Its downfall was not simply the result of European weapons or diseases, but a perfect storm of timing, betrayal, political fragmentation, and cultural upheaval that reshaped the Andes forever. By the early 16th century, the Inca Empire was at its peak, stretching over 2,500 miles along the western spine of South America, from modern-day Colombia to Chile. Yet beneath its imperial grandeur, tensions simmered. The death of the Sapa Inca Huayna Capac, likely from smallpox introduced by Europeans in advance of their arrival, left a dangerous power vacuum. His sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa, plunged the empire into a brutal civil war that would bleed it of strength, unity, and trust. When Francisco Pizarro and his small band of conquistadors landed on the Peruvian coast in 1532, they arrived not as invaders facing a solid empire, but as opportunists entering a fractured realm. The civil war had just concluded. Atahualpa had emerged victorious, but the wounds were fresh, and the political balance was delicate. Many nobles resented his rule. The roads were littered with the aftershocks of conflict. Pizarro's first meeting with Atahualpa was at Cajamarca, a highland town where the Inca emperor had paused on his victory tour. The Spanish invited him to a meeting, a trap. On November 16, 1532, Atahualpa arrived with thousands of retainers, unarmed and confident. The Spanish priest Valverde presented him with a Bible and demanded he convert to Christianity. Atahualpa, confused by the object, cast it aside. The signal was given. Spanish troops attacked. With fewer than 200 men, the Spaniards, aided by cavalry, firearms, steel weapons, and shock tactics, massacred thousands of Incas in minutes. Cannons thundered. Horses, never seen before by the Inca, sowed terror, and Atahualpa was captured alive. The Inca Empire had been decapitated in a single afternoon. But the story didn't end there. Atahualpa, imprisoned, sought to negotiate. He famously offered a ransom, a room filled with gold and silver, in exchange for his freedom. Over the next months, temples across the empire were stripped bare to fill this promise. The treasure arrived in staggering quantities, yet it bought him nothing. In 1533, under pressure from rival Inca factions and fearing resistance, the Spanish executed Atahualpa by strangulation. From there, the collapse accelerated. The Spanish installed a puppet ruler, Manco Inca, but he soon rebelled. His forces laid siege to Cusco, but Spanish reinforcements prevailed. Manco retreated to the remote jungle stronghold of Vilcabamba, where a small Inca kingdom would survive tenuously for 4 more decades. What followed was not just conquest, but transformation. Temples were torn down, churches rose on sacred sites. The Quipus, the Inca's system of record-keeping, was banned. Native religious leaders were replaced by missionaries. Diseases spread, decimating populations who had no immunity. Entire communities vanished. The Spanish used long-standing rivalries to consolidate control. They allied with local groups who had resisted Inca rule. They exploited the Mita labor system to fuel silver mining and colonial agriculture. And yet, Inca resistance persisted in whispers. In the Andes, among displaced nobility, and in spiritual traditions that blended the old gods with the new saints. The final chapter came in 1572, when Spanish forces captured and executed Tupac Amaru, the last Inca ruler in Vilcabamba. With his death, the political lineage of the Inca kings ended, but their memory did not. In modern Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and beyond, the legacy of the Inca lives on. In language, millions still speak Quechua, once the tongue of empire. In architecture, the precision stones of Machu, Picchu, and Ollantaytambo still defy time. In agriculture, terracing canal systems, and crops like quinoa and potatoes continue to shape Andean life. And in identity, many indigenous communities trace their roots to the Inca, celebrating festivals like Inti Raymi, wearing traditional clothing, and honoring the Pachamama, Mother Earth. The fall of the Inca Empire reminds us of a world not simply conquered, but changed. A world where empires clashed not only in battle, but in belief, language, and memory. And a world where stories, even those buried under stone and time, still rise again. Like the morning sun over the mountains they once called home.